Welcome to the Microscopic Podcast presented by GoldRepublic. My name is Alexej Jordanov, and in this format I invite you to look at the world through different lenses, to see what's hidden in plain sight. We'll dive deep to understand the forces that drive macroeconomics, financial markets, and the emergence of a new monetary system with some money like gold, silver, and digital assets like Bitcoin. We'll also investigate how geopolitics and power games shape the world we live in, but also what can we learn from history to understand the present and prepare for the future. I hope you will get fresh insight and enjoy this conversation. If you do, as always, please give it a like and subscribe, but also leave your actions down below in the comment section and share it to those who need to hear this. But before I start, I'd like you to know that if you open an account at GoldRepublic, you will receive 1 free gram of gold. Just click on the link in the description. How would you say that the use of AI, the prominence of AI is nowadays in this? Some people compare it as literally a nuclear bomb. Do you agree or not in this? Because you've been mentioning like the deterrent aspect of technology in general. What's your view on that?
So I'm actually, the current book that I'm writing is on when technologies emerge, kind of what is the impact and how do different institutions or actors respond to it? And so one of the cases is nuclear weapons, one of the cases is AI. So I've been thinking a lot about these parallels, in what way are they similar, in what way are they different? I don't personally subscribe to the analogy of nuclear weapons for AI. I've used the example more that it's more like electricity, kind of more of an enabler and accelerates. Like electricity didn't kind of independently cause things to happen, right? We had things like lights, but they were, everything was analog. Everything was, you had a torch. And so now electricity just kind of accelerated that. And that's what I think AI is doing as well, which is it's taking systems that we've had and making them more efficient. And I think that's why, consulting firms like McKinsey are starting to lay people off, because that's a perfect task. That sort of management consulting is a perfect task for AI. You put in like anything that McKinsey, not anything, but a lot of what a management consulting firm does is the kind of question that you could easily put into ChatGPT. Like, what are the 3 things that 3 geopolitical risks that could affect the price of oil next year, or whatever? Or what are the 3 factors or the 5 factors that could affect supply chains next year? And so I think in that respect, AI is not, AI is not something that has the kind of excess. I'm not personally persuaded by this existential risk narrative of AI. And I've been spending a lot of time. Well, I've been spending a lot of time trying to think through where that would come from. And one of the arguments is that like people who study experts in a particular issue tend to be more sensitive to the risks that technology would face. And that's something that, in this book I'm writing that cuts across technologies, I see that has happened every time, is that people who are studying these issues are more likely to think that risk is more salient because they're like, let's say, I have this friend who is in the business of oncology. And it's hard to say causally which way the causal arrow goes, but he thinks there are 500 cancers that are likely to get him, and because he studies cancer, and so he's aware of these things much more acutely than I am. And the question is whether I should be as worried as he is, or he should take a step back and realize that he needs to live his life, and that these things are, the kind of whatever, that's the sort of orthogonal, but kind of this question of like, how do we think about risk, and why are the experts like 100 times more likely to see risk in these issues than a generalist? But that's very much the case. And there's this political kind of psychology of risk that this person at the University of Pennsylvania, Phil Tetlock, has studied, has spent almost part of his career trying to figure out why experts overestimate the risk in the area that they study. There are a lot of reasons that he points to, but that is the reality. And that, when you want something forecasted, you actually don't want to ask the specialist in that area. You want to ask someone who's more of a generalist. So anyway, it's a long answer, but there is this kind of question of like, how do we evaluate the risk of something that hasn't come to fruition? And how do we think about, regulating something that is kind of on the horizon rather than something that is happening already? So when people talk about when people talk about AI risk, for example, and I push them on this, they talk about things like bias and discrimination. They talk about labor dislocations. I wouldn't put either of those in the category of existential risk. So I think it's important when we think about these questions of policy to be actually being specific about what we think the risk factors are, to be able to scope appropriate responses.
Mm.
So it sounds like you think there's existential risk to AI. Where do you see it?
I think it's a very good nuance you're giving, because it gives a perspective of the actual definition. If you want to go into semantics, existential risk means risk of annihilation of something, meaning that from one day to another, there's no more people. That would be the existential risk, right? And I think I've actually military, let's say, minded people, I think do make this association much more than other people who do not necessarily assess what the meaning of life as a human life is in that sense, because that's what it would mean. And obviously AI would not be able to wipe out, just like a nuclear bomb would, a whole city, a whole country even nowadays, or a whole continent probably, with the current amount of nuclear weapons we have, the whole world. But it does create a threat in, let's say, for example, economic warfare with AI-driven cyber attacks that could triple critical infrastructure or industrial control systems, or causing massive economic disruptions, intellectual property theft, all kinds of questions that are not existential, but that are of greater significance in just the way society functions.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I appreciate that point. I think one of the things that has been really helpful in writing and researching this book is going back in time to other new technologies. And then, I kind of have concluded that there's a collective amnesia that we all have, and kind of being so present-minded that we don't realize that these hype cycles are pretty recurrent. Every time there's a new technology, it's like, the world is going to end. I was like, I was reflecting and revisiting the Y2K computer kind of thing, where like the year 2000 was coming along and the world was going to end because computers weren't able to accommodate the year 2000. And, you look back and you think, what were we all worried about? And the question that I think is hard to answer, and even like with cyber, the pessimistic warnings about the cyber 9/11 or the cyber Pearl Harbor have not come, I would argue, anywhere close to fruition. And the only question in my mind is whether we haven't seen that because it wasn't going to happen anyway, or because that kind of rhetoric triggers mechanisms like feedback loops, feedback mechanisms that erect guardrails. And that's why we haven't seen those outcomes. But what I can say, looking at all these new technologies over time, is that these rhetorical cycles are always the same. The technology emerges. I will say it almost always goes too far. And, I'm looking in my book at why that is. But the fact is that new technologies emerge. They always scale a little too far, a little too aggressively. But what that does, the effect that has, is to trigger these feedback mechanisms that then rein in those technologies, create guardrails, and create a much kind of reined in version of that technology. And you saw this with nuclear weapons, which is, and I was just working on that earlier, the story of nuclear weapons and these scientists, they're involved in understanding the atom and fission, and then the Manhattan Project. And then 1945 comes along and they see the Trinity test and they say, what the heck? How did this happen? And, I look back and I think almost like, what did you think you were working on? How could you not have foreseen this? And then from there, from 1945, we see from a 15 kiloton bomb to a 50 megaton bomb. So this is like orders of magnitude greater than what the U.S. had started with. Now it's, the Soviets testing a 50 megaton bomb. And what happens there is then from that kind of emerges this collective sense that we need to do arms control. Okay, we need to do arms control. And so, I end up on a qualified, optimistic note on technology, not because I think that the innovators always know boundaries, but because almost the opposite, that they go too far. And by doing that, they trigger these feedback mechanisms that prevent us from kind of going off a cliff.
Okay, interesting. So basically the fear is kind of projected, that then creates a feedback loop of regulating and basically keeping it in rein, so to say, and in check, because you're projecting always the worst case scenario.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, luckily, but there's been also moments, for example, in the Cold War, where we've been just very close from just nuclear cataclysms, just based on misunderstanding. So the thing is, yes, maybe that there's those maybe guardrails, but there's also moments where through just mere miscommunication or interpreting or maybe a faulty system, it could have come to moments where, you and I would have not been talking today. Maybe not many people have been talking to. So the propensity of margin of error, the consequence then increases exponentially based on what the available technology can do. And I think a lot of that is obviously lots of doom thinking that is ingrained maybe in our primal brain of fear and just seeing always danger, that maybe also in a way safeguards us, or as a way of survival. But it is interesting to maybe see these developments as they are. But you're mainly positive about it. That's the bottom line.
Well, yeah, I have these arguments with a colleague who thinks that the only reason that we haven't ended up dead is because of luck, just sheer luck. Those scenarios you talk about, which is like, we got close a lot of times. That's his point. And like, the only reason this didn't result is not because of anything we constructed to rein it in, but just like happenstance. And then what I would say is that the more of those things that happen that don't go wrong, I think corroborates my optimism, which is there's something more systematic at play that is preventing us from going off a cliff. I was thinking about this morning, kind of these ethical questions of like, when we've had other types of technologies emerge, like why, and I'm a little totally outside my lane here. So this might not even be feasible, but I remember like a couple decades ago, and there was this question of like, were we going to just clone a bunch of people that were just like literal clones of you? And like, ethically, like, should we allow that? And science is going to do that. And we're going to end up in this brave new world. And why aren't we there? Like, I do wonder, why are we not there? Why do these worst case scenarios why do they not end up happening? I don't know. I think there's a reason for it. And I think it's the reason, I think it's a real tension. On the one hand, I think there are these kind of arms race prisoners dilemma dynamics like when I look at the Manhattan Project and I think, was there any way for these scientists to stop what they were doing in 1944? And a couple of them had their reservations and actually off-ramped, but they couldn't single-handedly do it. But let's say collectively, the Manhattan Project scientists had said, we just don't believe in this anymore. Could they have stopped it? And I think the problem was that the structural pressures to carry on were so strong because it was this, if the US didn't do it, it was pretty clear someone else would. And you don't want to be the one that is now vulnerable because Germany or Russia or whoever has developed the bomb. And now you sanctimoniously were like, well, I didn't think this was the right thing to do. Well, now you're screwed. And I think there are those pressures in AI, and it's both financial, but it's also like that genie is kind of out of the bottle and you can't really put it back. But that's a different dynamic. To say that there are these pressures that will lead it kind of in a dangerous road, that all is true. But why does that road just not lead us off cliffs? I think it's because there at the same time is a collective incentive to ensure that we don't go off a cliff. What that will look like in AI, I think, is different from what it would look like in nuclear weapons, and in part because it's hard to say. In nuclear weapons, we had kind of getting to that point of 50 megatons or 35,000 warheads between the US and the Soviet Union is very kind of tractable. What those numbers are, you can measure that. No one can even agree on what artificial general intelligence is. So how do we kind of have an analogous, almost like red line in AI? But that might be kind of a double-edged. It might be kind of, maybe the fact that we can't agree on what that threshold, what that red line is a good thing, which is that we're not going to have that same, and I think it comes back to our discussion about existential risk. Maybe there's no red line because the risk isn't existential in AI the way it is in nuclear weapons.
But then when we look back at the initial thesis of your book, which is about accountability and about war, mm-hmm. and now we tie it back to AI and about the way governments then, because you're talking about regulation and all kinds of things, the lack of accountability in that equation would be problematic, isn't it? Mm-hmm. If it pertains like this, if the system is just disconnected from what it's ought to serve, which is the people or the interest of the people, how does that equate then?
Yeah, it's a good question, because what's different now, so if you think about like nuclear weapon, another reason why nuclear weapons are different from AI. So if you think about the nuclear arsenal, contractors produced these intercontinental ballistic missiles, but they didn't just kind of do that on their own. They had a contract to go do that for the government. And then the government said, okay, we created these, peacekeeper missiles or these Minuteman missiles. Now we're going to destroy all of them because of this arms control agreement. And then they go destroy them all. But AI is all private sector. These are all private firms. They're not responding to a government contract. They're just out creating these new technologies. And I think that's why I was just listening to a podcast with the CEO of Anthropic. And he was, because all these CEOs say we want government.
Sorry,
oh, go ahead.
Who's Anthropic? Maybe just for the context.
Oh,
what did Anthropic do?
Anthropic is the second largest developer of generative AI. So OpenAI is probably the best known, but Anthropic split off from OpenAI a few years ago because they have these philosophical differences with the OpenAI approach, which is that Anthropic wanted to do a more ethical version of generative AI. And so that's what they have, that's what they set off to do. And so this, the CEO was saying that what makes AI so exciting and so perilous at the same time is its existential growth curve. Like it is scaling so quickly, like a hockey stick almost. And So these CEOs like Dario Amodei say we want government telling us, here are the boundaries you need to play by. But at the same time, because again, you can't clearly distinguish what those risks are. I think government has, at least in the US side, I think this is different in Europe, has been reluctant to be very heavy-handed about it. And in the book that I'm writing, it's pretty clear that generally that's the case, which is that regulators are pretty reactive. They're going to wait until there's kind of like, what is the red line? There aren't very many incentives to proactively legislate something that doesn't have a kind of clear and present danger.
And they're always behind. They play catch up.
So they catch up, exactly.
Yeah.
Again, because I think the incentives aren't quite there for them to be proactive. And frankly, they just don't there's a real kind of expertise asymmetry. They don't really understand these issues. And so they don't have staff dedicated to them. And so there are so many reasons why they're always playing catch up.
So it's safe to say that there will be basically a moment where it will be too late if things escalate on the legislative side. I mean, if I look at Congress hearings from, I don't know, the big tech firms, and they have to explain the internet to those congressmen, I'm laughing and crying at the same time, because I'm thinking those people, they legislate.
Right. Again, because their big goal is they want to bring jobs to their district, and it's not clear like what that actually means. Like, so the way the legislators operate, is they want to get reelected. And the way they can do that is to avoid getting blamed for anything, and to bring very concrete dividends to their state or to their district. And these kinds of regulatory questions just don't fit neatly into that. And in my research, what I've been finding is that the exceptions to that are when something bubbles up to a point within the public that the incentives are created then for legislators to do something. But in the US context, that just really hasn't happened in AI. I was just looking at public opinion polls that show that the public is, they're worried about automation. And I think that's why you see some efforts on the part of legislators to look like they're doing something, but it's not even clear what they can really do about that. And I think this issue is also different because if the risk is job dislocation, there was a lot of worry a few years ago with kind of increase in robotics, whether like Amazon warehouses would become too automated and it would put out of work kind of like blue collar workers. I think there's less worry here because politically, neither party is like, yes, let's save all the white collar jobs. Like, I think there's a sense that that's not kind of a good rallying cry politically. But what I think is really interesting is just the differences between Europe and the US on this. Europe has been much more aggressive in proactively taking steps on AI regulation.
Yes, we like to overregulate here. That's another problem. if we could regulate.
Yeah, so I think that's sort of the question I come, or sort of the point I come around to is that there's no right answer here. And so, you say overregulation, and I think that's a risk, which is, the biggest firms in the world, biggest companies in the world are American companies that do tech. And I think that has happened because the US has been more hands off. And so they're like, why would the US lean in more aggressively? Because there would be this real kind of disservice to the economy, but also, we talked about China and the tech competition. So anything that would be heavy-handed from a regulatory perspective would also have these adverse geopolitical consequences. And I think it's just a lot different in Europe because those big tech companies probably have not arisen in a European context because of that heavy-handedness from a regulatory perspective. But also then there aren't these constituencies to be sensitive to and responsive to because those tech companies don't aren't at the scale as they are in the US. So I do think that these kind of economic contexts are very different. And again, one of the themes of our conversation is everything is very complicated from a causal perspective. It's hard to say which thing came first. But I think Europe clearly is much more concerned and leaning into kind of a risk aversion that drives its regulatory approach than the US is. And so we'll see over time. I think it really depends on what you're trying to optimize. So I was going to say, we'll see over time which one of these is more successful. And probably both the US and Europe will say that they were successful. They were just successful doing different things.
Well, it depends on which perspective, obviously. If we talk about power, I think the US will have the upper hand. I mean, if we look at developments in AI, correct me if I'm wrong, but clearly the leading actors worldwide is the US, China, but there's just like two main blocks, and Europe is just in between and falls into the laps of either one.
I'm not European, so I don't want to dunk on the European approach, but I think what European regulators would say is that they're working on ensuring privacy and data security, and that those things, even if you can't point to those as like a measure of something, that those have inherent value. I think what the US approach is saying is that these other factors are more important, economic factors or power factors. And so, one of the conclusions of my book is that I don't think that there's a prescriptive approach of like, this is the right way to do it. I think it's just more mindfulness is like, as I always like to say, there are no solutions. They're just trade-offs, and everything's just a trade-off. You have to think about like, what are you trying to do? And I think the US is clearly much more mindful of those kind of sort of the power and economic factors than they are some of these kind of data privacy kinds of considerations.
On the, let's say AI race, where do you see now like the leading? The US is obviously confronted to China. Is China like in that sense a paper tiger, or they really have the potential to be an actual real threat in the AI arena?
Yeah. Actually, and like segueing from what we were just saying, I've heard this expression that the US innovates,
China copies.
Europe regulates, and China imitates. Yeah, and so I think I think China's really good at imitating what others have done, and some people will say that that's because of industrial espionage, and I'm sure some of that is true. But yeah, I don't think they'll be very far behind. But I think I'm of the view that there was so much rhetoric a few years ago about how China was leading in AI, and I just don't see how anyone can, with a straight face, can support that argument anymore. I just think it's so clear that these American firms have really taken off in AI development. And what I see happening now is just because like there is almost like a winner take all in that industry because of the need to like scale is so important, and resources. And that's why Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, is trying to like have this like fiefdom of advanced AI chips, like trillions of dollars worth of AI chips, because that's where it's at. You can't do this well unless you have compute power. And so that's something that China lacks. These US firms have the GPUs that China doesn't. And so I think China can try to imitate. It's just going to be impeded from doing that successfully because it doesn't have the compute power, and it doesn't have that because of these export controls. These are US chips, US GPUs. The U.S. government has said that the U.S. And its allies, TSMC in Taiwan cannot sell these chips to China either anymore. So I think China, as much as it wants to imitate, is going to be impeded from doing that. So I think in for the foreseeable future, because of that winner take all, and I would say winner of like the top, these big. There's a reason why these AI startups all partnered with big tech. Anthropic, the company I mentioned, is working with, I think it's Amazon now. So Amazon's dumping billions of dollars because they have the resources, and it takes billions of dollars to resource these developments. And now only a handful of companies can do that. And so everyone else who's trying is going to be really kind of held back because they don't have those resources.
But on the other hand, China has a peculiar system and advantage that the US doesn't, and that's maybe access to data in the way that they monitor everything. They're able to, without any like privacy. What privacy? That's like, it's irrelevant. That's I'm going to use the data if I want to, and they have much more liberty in that sense that maybe Western countries like the US doesn't, because there's still some checks and balances about what you can do and what you cannot do.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Like, that's something that I think is going to be playing out in the next couple of years in the courts in the United States on copyright. Still these models are just like trawling the internet for just like this, just grabbing, pulling in all of the data that's out there. And I think this is when I talk about some of these structural the combination of structural and like just go until you're told that you can't anymore. Like these AI platforms are basically just kind of like grabbing until they're sued and told they can't. So in that regard, there haven't been as many barriers to data in the US as certainly China has no barriers, but in the Western context, I don't think these AI platforms have really run into a lot of barriers in terms of data collection. Now they're running into some, and I think that's where these copyright issues will very much come into play. And we haven't quite seen how that will all play out. Like, we know that the New York Times sued OpenAI. So yes, there are. I guess it's fair to say that the U.S. these companies in the U.S. are not totally unimpeded the way China would be. And you're right; it's all about it's about the compute power, and it's about the vast volume of data. You can't prescribe what the right policy response should be, because I really think that this is a matter of kind of what we value. Do we value innovation, or do we value kind of a more cautious, risk averse approach? What I would just say is that from my perspective, it's important to have mapped that landscape so that we know which trade-offs are being made. And I think it's very easy when you're kind of in these moments of technological change to not be looking forward enough and not be looking back. And I think actually some people are often better at kind of projecting out than they are looking back. And it's, what I would like to think is the contribution of this book I'm writing is, by looking back, we can gain actually a lot of clues about some of this pattern matching that I like to call it, pattern matching of, we've seen some of this before. What can we learn from it? And I think by looking back, we can see that there is this collective amnesia about kind of like these hype cycles of new technologies, that we've seen this before. Why do we not see society go off, or politics go off a cliff? It's because these innovators do tend to push really hard. And in a lot of respects, they end up pushing so hard that they trigger these feedback mechanisms. And those feedback mechanisms, I think, are really important. The question is, how far do they need to go? And that's where I would just come back to this conclusion that there's no right answer there. There's just a question of how do you frame the problem.
Sarah, thanks a lot for your precious time. Just like Bitcoin, it's limited and valuable.
Thank you. I appreciate you being so knowledgeable and asking such thoughtful questions.
Thank you. Well, I hope that the viewers and listeners have enjoyed this conversation. I've at least enjoyed it very much. It broadened my sense of a lot of topics and things that I actually didn't know. And I hope we can follow up on other topics, because we've just, I think, covered one part of what you know, and just covered like on a maybe more general level on some topics. But I would love in maybe future episodes and future moments dive deeper in particular topics. So I hope this was a good, let's say, teaser overall of what we could discuss in the future.
Thank you. I'd love that. This was a great conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. Take care. And also, people can find you on X, right? You have your book that is available also online on Amazon and all kinds of other books. And maybe you want to tune in or cue in the title of your next book and maybe a few words about when it's going to be available and why people should buy it.
We'll leave that as TBD, but I think people will want to buy it because, especially your listeners, your macroscopic podcast, is that this is a kind of grand tour of new technologies and how societies and polities think about them, and those risks that we talked about, the under versus over response over time, and what we can learn from history about all those questions.
Awesome. Great. I'm really looking forward myself to read that book. So keep us updated and I wish you the best. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, give it a like and don't forget to subscribe. Leave your actions down below in the comment section. And if you want to watch more videos, feel free to check the most recent video, but also any other video that we've had published on the channel before. See you next time.